The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His hands trembled as he handed me the envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with red wax that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Mr. Sharma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm obligated to inform you that you've inherited the Ambuja cement factory from your late uncle, Vikram Sharma. However, I must strongly advise you." He paused, swallowing hard. "Don't go there. Sell it. Demolish it. But whatever you do, don't set foot inside after dark." I should have listened. My uncle Vikram had been estranged from the family for 30 years. The official story was that he'd gone mad, retreating to his cement factory in the remote hills of Rajasthan, refusing all contact with the outside world. When they found his body 3 weeks ago, he'd been dead for at least a month, his corpse perfectly preserved in a coating of fine cement dust. The factory was worth millions. I was a struggling architect, drowning in debt. The decision seemed obvious. I arrived at the factory on a scorching afternoon in June. The building loomed against the desert sky like a monument to industrial decay. A massive concrete structure with towering silos and conveyor belts frozen in mid-operation. The main gates hung open, rusted hinges screaming in the hot wind. The security guard, an ancient man named Ramesh, sat in a small booth near the entrance. His eyes widened when he saw me approach. "You're Vikram's nephew?" he asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Yes, I'm Arjun Sharma. I'm the new owner." Ramesh shook his head slowly. "You should leave. This place, it's not right. Hasn't been right for 10 years. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, and I could smell the tobacco on his breath. 10 years ago, there was an accident. 23 workers were killed when silo number 7 collapsed. They were buried under tons of cement. Your uncle, he ordered the silo sealed, said it would cost too much to recover the bodies, said their families would be compensated. That's terrible, but he never paid them. Not a single rupee. The families cursed this place. And then the workers started seeing things, hearing things. One by one, they left. Your uncle stayed, alone, working the factory by himself for years. Ramesh's voice dropped to a whisper. They say he was making something that wasn't cement. I dismissed his warnings as superstition. I had plans. I'd renovate the factory, sell it to a major corporation, clear my debts, and start fresh. I spent the afternoon touring the facility, taking notes, photographing the equipment. The place was in better condition than I'd expected. The machinery looked almost operational. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of blood orange, I decided to stay the night in the factory's administrative building. Ramesh had already left, practically running to his motorcycle when I told him my plans. Lock all the doors, he'd said. And whatever you hear, don't go into the main production hall. Especially don't go near silo number 7. The administrative building was surprisingly comfortable. My uncle had lived in a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor, a bedroom, bathroom, and what appeared to be a study. The study was where things got strange. The walls were covered in blueprints, but not for cement production. These were architectural drawings of impossible structures, buildings that defied physics, with angles that hurt to look at, and dimensions that seemed to fold in on themselves. Mathematical equations covered every available surface, complex formulas I didn't recognize despite my engineering degree. In the center of the room stood a drafting table. On it lay a single blueprint, more recent than the others. It showed the factory itself, but with modifications. Additional chambers had been drawn beneath the existing structure, going down hundreds of feet into the earth. At the bottom was a chamber labeled simply, the Kiln. Beside the blueprint lay my uncle's journal. I shouldn't have opened it. The first entries were mundane, production notes, financial calculations, worker schedules. But about 10 years ago, right around the time of the accident, the tone changed dramatically. June 15th. The collapse was no accident. I finally got the mixture right. The limestone, the clay, the gypsum, all standard. But the catalyst, the binding agent that makes it truly permanent, that requires something else, something organic, something that once lived.
June 20th. The families are making noise,
Demanding the bodies. Fools. They don't understand that their loved ones are part of something greater now. The cement produced from that mixture is perfect, unbreakable, eternal. I've sealed the silo. No one can interfere with the process.
July 3rd.
I can hear them at night. Voices in the pipes, whispers in the ventilation system. They're not screaming, they're singing the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. They understand now.
They're grateful.
August 12th. I've begun the expansion.
The chambers beneath the factory will allow for greater production.
I've discovered that the cement doesn't just bind materials, it binds souls. The workers in Silo 7 aren't dead, they're transformed, preserved, perfect.
The journal entries became increasingly unhinged,
My uncle's handwriting deteriorating into barely legible scrawls. The final entry was dated 3 months ago.
They're calling me now, every night, louder and louder. They want me to join them, to complete the work.
I know what I must do. I must go into the kiln. I must become the final catalyst. Then the factory will be complete. Then the cement will be alive. I closed the journal, my hand shaking. This was insane. My uncle had clearly suffered a complete mental breakdown. The accident had driven him mad with guilt, and he'd constructed this elaborate delusion to cope with what he'd done. That's what I told myself. Then I heard the singing. It started low, almost below the threshold of hearing. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As I stood frozen in the study, the sound grew louder, resolving into voices. Dozens of voices. Hundreds. They were coming from below. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave, to get in my car and drive back to civilization, to never look back. But there was something hypnotic about the singing, something that pulled at me like a physical force. I found myself walking down the stairs, through the administrative building's lobby and out into the factory yard. The main production hall loomed before me, its massive doors standing open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The singing was louder now, and I could almost make out words, or what might have been words in a language I didn't recognize. The sound resonated in my chest, in my bones, synchronizing with my heartbeat. I stepped inside. The production hall was vast, a cathedral of concrete and steel. Conveyor belts crisscrossed the space at different levels, connecting massive grinding machines, mixing vats and storage silos. Moonlight streamed through grimy windows high above, casting everything in a pale, ghostly glow. The singing was all around me now, coming from the walls themselves. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed something strange about the concrete. It seemed to shimmer, as if something was moving just beneath its surface. I approached one of the walls and pressed my hand against it. It was warm. Concrete shouldn't be warm, not like this. This was body heat. I snatched my hand away and saw that it had left an impression in the wall. Not a dent, but my handprint outlined in a slightly darker gray, as if the concrete was marking where I'd touched it. As I watched, the handprint began to move, sliding slowly up the wall like something was pushing it from behind. Jesus Christ, I whispered, backing away. The singing intensified, becoming almost joyful. More handprints began appearing on the walls, then faces. Dozens of faces pressing through the concrete like people trapped beneath ice. Their features distorted but recognizable as human. Their mouths moved in time with the singing. One of the faces looked familiar. I pulled out my phone and compared it to a photo in my uncle's journal. A worker named Suresh Patel, one of the 23 who died in the collapse. His face was frozen in what might have been a smile, and his lips formed words I was beginning to understand. Join us, complete the cycle, become eternal. I ran. I made it halfway to the door before the conveyor belt started moving. There was no power to the factory, I'd checked, but the ancient machinery groaned to life anyway, rusty metal screaming as it began its rhythmic rotation. The grinding machine started spinning, and the mixing vats began to churn with something that glowed faintly in the darkness. The singing became deafening. I burst through the doors and into the factory yard, gasping for air. But when I looked back, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The factory was breathing. The entire structure expanded and contracted rhythmically, and with each breath, cement dust puffed from its chimneys like exhalations. My uncle's journal had mentioned chambers beneath the factory. If there was any explanation for this nightmare, it would be there. I found the entrance near silo number 7, a heavy steel door set into the ground, partially hidden by sand and debris. The door was unlocked, and when I pulled it open, a wave of hot air hit me, carrying with it the smell of burning limestone and something else. Something organic and wrong. A metal staircase descended into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and started down. The stairs went down much farther than they should have. I counted 300 steps before I reached the first landing. The walls here were different, not concrete, but some kind of smooth, off-white material that was definitely organic. It had the texture of bone. The landing opened into a corridor lined with doors. Each door had a small window, and through them, I could see what looked like cells. In each cell was a person, or what had once been a person. They were partially embedded in the walls, their bodies merged with the same bone-like material. But they weren't dead. Their eyes followed me as I passed, and their lips moved with that same endless singing. One of them was more free than the others, with an arm that could still move. As I passed, she reached out and grabbed my sleeve. I nearly screamed. "Please," she whispered, her voice crackling like dry cement. "Please don't let him finish. He's in the kiln. He's becoming the heart. If he completes the transformation, the factory will be able to spread. It will reproduce. There will be more factories, more workers, more souls bound forever. You have to stop him. You have to destroy the kiln." How? I managed to choke out. Fire won't work. The cement is already burned. Water won't work, it's already cured. But it was made from earth. Limestone, clay, gypsum. Earth can reclaim it. You have to break the binding at its source. You have to shatter the heart before it fully forms. She released my sleeve and slumped back against the wall, her energy spent. I continued down the corridor, past dozens more cells, each containing a worker from the factory's past. Some had been there for years, based on how deeply they'd merged with the walls. Others were more recent, their human features still clearly visible. At the end of the corridor was another staircase, spiraling down into red-lit darkness. The heat increased with every step, and the singing grew so loud it was almost painful. The air itself seemed to vibrate with it. I reached the bottom and found myself standing before a massive chamber carved from solid rock. In the center, surrounded by a network of pipes and vents, was the kiln, a cylindrical furnace the size of a small building, glowing with an inner fire that cast dancing shadows on the walls. But the kiln wasn't just a furnace anymore. It had been transformed into something else. The concrete had grown over it like a tumor, forming structures that looked almost like organs. I could see what might have been arteries pulsing with glowing cement, and chambers that expanded and contracted like lungs. And at the very center, visible through a translucent section of the structure, was my uncle. He was still recognizably human, but he'd become the core of this thing. His body spread out like nerve tissue, his face visible in dozens of places at once, his eyes opening and closing in a rhythm that matched the factory's breathing. He was still alive, still conscious. And when he saw me, all of his faces smiled. "Arjun," his voices said in unison, the sound coming from speakers formed of hardened cement. "You came. I knew you would. The factory called to you, just as it called to me. You have the family gift, the ability to see beyond the mundane, to understand that architecture isn't just about building structures. It's about building realities, creating spaces where the laws of nature can be rewritten." "Uncle Vikram," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What have you done?" "I've created life from death, purpose from tragedy. Those workers, they didn't die in vain. They became part of something greater. They became the foundation of a new kind of existence. Cement isn't just a building material, Arjun. It's a medium, a canvas. And with the right catalyst, the right binding agent, it can become a vessel for consciousness, for immortality. This isn't immortality. It's a nightmare.
You've trapped them. They're in agony.
Are they? All of his faces tilt. I lunged for the sledgehammer just as the concrete floor turned to liquid beneath my feet. I managed to grab the handle, but my legs were already sinking into the gray slurry. It was like quicksand, pulling me down with surprising strength. The singing changed pitch, becoming aggressive, angry. The walls began to close in, and the pipes started leaking streams of wet cement that moved with purpose, reaching for me like tentacles. I swung the sledgehammer at the nearest pipe, and it shattered with a satisfying crack. Glowing cement sprayed everywhere, hissing where it hit the walls. The factory shuddered, and for a moment my uncle's faces contorted in what might have been pain. "Stop," his voices commanded. "You're hurting it. You're hurting all of us." "Good," I shouted back, pulling myself out of the liquefied floor and onto a more solid section near the wall. I swung the hammer again, this time at one of the organ-like structures that had grown around the kiln. The impact sent cracked spider webbing through the hardened cement, and something that looked disturbingly like blood leaked from the fractures. The chamber went berserk. The cement tentacles multiplied, lashing out from every direction. The workers' faces appeared on every surface, their mouths open in silent screams. The temperature skyrocketed as the kiln burned brighter, trying to produce more cement to repair the damage. I dodged a whip of liquid concrete and swung the hammer at another pipe, then another. Each impact weakened the structure, but there were too many connections, too much cement flowing through the system. I needed to hit the heart directly. The central column where my uncle's transformed body served as the catalyst for the entire operation. But it was protected by layers of hardened cement, reinforced with steel rebar that glowed red-hot from the kiln's heat. That's when I remembered the pneumatic drill. I dropped the sledgehammer and ran for the drill, sliding under a wave of wet cement that tried to engulf me. My hands closed around the drill's handle, and I pulled it free from the pile. There was a compressor nearby, still connected to the factory's pneumatic system. I dragged the drill over to it and hooked up the air hose. "Please work," I prayed. "Please let there be enough pressure." The drill roared to life. "No," my uncle's voices screamed in unison. "You don't understand what you're doing. If you destroy the heart before the transformation completes, the entire structure will destabilize. The cement will revert to its raw components. Everyone trapped in it will be free." I finished for him. "They'll finally be able to rest." I charged at the central column, drill screaming. The cement tentacles wrapped around my legs, my arms trying to pull me back. But I'd built up enough momentum. I slammed into the column and drove the drill bit into its surface. The sound was deafening, metal grinding through concrete, the pneumatic compressor whining under the strain, my uncle's voices howling in anguish. The drill bit carved through the outer layers of cement, through the steel reinforcement, deeper and deeper toward the pulsing core. The workers' singing reached a crescendo, but now it sounded different. Not angry or aggressive. It sounded hopeful. The drill bit punched through the final layer and into my uncle's transformed flesh. Everything stopped. The tentacles froze mid-strike. The singing cut off abruptly, leaving only an echoing silence. The red glow from the kiln began to fade, cooling from white-hot to cherry red to dull orange. My uncle's faces went blank, their eyes unfocusing. When he spoke again, his voice was weak, barely audible. "Thank you." Then the cracks began to spread. They radiated out from the central column like lightning, racing across the cement organs, up the pipes, across the walls. Wherever a crack appeared, the cement crumbled, reverting to dry powder that rained down like snow. The worker embedded in the wall near the staircase, the one who'd told me what to do, smiled as the cracks reached her. The cement around her body disintegrated and she slumped forward, her physical form decaying rapidly but peacefully, as if she'd been dead for years. and was finally allowed to return to dust. I ran for the stairs, pulling the drill free and dropping it. Behind me, the chamber was collapsing, the kiln crumbling inward as its cement shell fell away. I could see my uncle's body at the center, finally released from its prison, finally allowed to die. I took the stairs 3 at a time, racing ahead of the collapse. The corridor with the cells was coming apart, the walls dissolving, releasing the trapped workers. Their bodies aged instantly, decades of suspended time catching up with them, but the expressions on their faces were of relief. The main production hall was worse. The entire factory was shaking itself apart. Massive chunks of concrete fell from the ceiling, and the silos were splitting open like eggshells. Through the cracks in silo number 7, I could see bones. The original 23 workers, finally revealed after a decade of entombment. I burst out into the factory yard just as the main building began to implode. The machinery was tearing itself apart, metal screaming as stress fractures ripped through every support beam and joint. The conveyor belts snapped, whipping through the air like enormous metal snakes. I didn't stop running until I reached the main gate. Only then did I turn to watch. The factory collapsed in on itself in a matter of minutes, the silos toppling, the production hall caving in, the administrative building crumbling. Dust rose in a massive cloud, glowing faintly in the moonlight with whatever supernatural properties my uncle had imbued it with. And then, as the dust settled, I heard it one last time. The singing. But it was different now. It was peaceful, grateful. A choir of voices expressing relief and gratitude before fading away into silence. The wind picked up, carrying the dust away across the desert. By the time the sun rose, there was nothing left of the Ambuja cement factory but a pile of rubble and the rusted skeleton of industrial equipment. The investigation concluded that the factory had suffered from decades of structural neglect and had finally collapsed due to foundation failure. My uncle's body was found in the ruins and given a proper burial. The families of the 23 workers killed in the original accident were finally able to recover their loved ones' remains and lay them to rest. I sold the land to a solar power company. They're building a clean energy facility there now. I've visited the site twice during construction, and I'm happy to report that the concrete they're using is completely normal. No warm patches, no singing, no faces pressing through from the other side. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear them. The workers, my uncle, all the souls that were bound in that cement. They're not singing anymore. They're not crying out. They're just there, somewhere, resting. I quit architecture after that summer. I couldn't bring myself to work with concrete anymore. Couldn't look at a building without wondering what might be hidden in its foundation, what sacrifices might have been made to create something permanent and strong. My uncle's journal is locked in a safe deposit box in Mumbai. I've read it cover to cover a dozen times trying to understand what drove him to such madness. The mathematics he developed, the formulae for using organic catalysts in cement production. It's all theoretically sound. In the wrong hands, someone could replicate what he did. But I've kept it hidden. Some knowledge isn't meant to be shared. Sometimes I wonder if there are other factories out there. Other mad visionaries who've discovered the same terrible secret. I wonder how many buildings around the world might be singing. Their occupants just too distracted to hear it. I've started sleeping with earplugs, and I've made a decision. If I ever hear that singing again, that beautiful, terrible chorus of souls bound in concrete, I'll know what to do. I'll find the source. I'll take a sledgehammer to it. Because some prisons are worse than death, and some materials were never meant to live. The cement mixer was running again in the desert, though the factory was long gone. If you pressed your ear to the ground, you could still hear it. Grinding, mixing, binding. Waiting for someone to build again. Waiting for someone to listen to the singing in the walls. Waiting for the next architect brave enough or foolish enough to try. Ambuja, Latin for water. But some liquids aren't meant to be disturbed. Some mixtures shouldn't be poured. Some foundations are better left unbuilt. The end.